just in awe of that perspective that you gain from being in space. You look down and all of humanity lives on this planet. So you get this really great perspective of how important, how special it is.
In-space manufacturing is not science fiction. It is a new space economy, the new frontier. We can make things better and faster if we manufacture them in space. We're really rethinking the way we might live 50 years from now.
I have now viewed a broader perspective of national security. I think there's a desire to have closer integration. We're going to have to work together in order to be successful.
And in 1993, she became the first female fighter pilot.
I had no interest in being the first. I just wanted to be a fighter pilot. We all have the chance to be part of something bigger than ourselves. I challenge you to take advantage of this opportunity.
So just another day at the office.
The best office in the world.
Wow. Wow. What a great event. What a great day. I can't tell you how honored we are to be here. I mean, look at the stage. Look at all of you. Look at that. So that's really what I want to talk about today. I mean, we're going to talk about the convergence of space and defense. And those domains are so interconnected now. We know they're all contested and they're vital. And I got to tell you, when I first saw this lineup for this event, I kind of thought, what am I doing here? I mean, let's just look at this. We've got Lieutenant General. Does anybody know what Lieutenant General means? Some of you? It's a 3-star. A 3-star. We got 2 3-stars up here. So Lieutenant General Jeannie Leavitt, the first Air Force female combat pilot, the first female fighter pilot. We went through pilot training around the same time. And when I went through, women weren't allowed to be fighter pilots, although they should have been. So Jeannie busted through that. She's a trailblazer in mission integration and I would say leadership. And we've been stationed together while around each other for a while. I got to see her come up and do amazing things. So we have Lieutenant General Mary O'Brien, a strategist shaping modern command and defense readiness in multi-domain operations. If you don't know what multi-domain ops are, we'll talk a little bit about that. Dr. Debbie Sineski, Stanford professor, co-founder of Astro Materials, pioneering technologies for extreme environments that advance aerospace and resilience. And then finally, Peggy Whitson, America's most experienced astronaut, more time in space than any other American, former NASA chief astronaut with more days in space than anybody else. Well, any American, I guess a cosmonaut. Yeah, we'll fix that. We'll get to that. So when I looked at this lineup, I thought, like, what am I going to add? So what I'll do is I'm going to focus on them, and we're going to start with some questions. And the first thing I want to do is really set the context for space as a critical domain, because it's really tough, I think, to understand up there when we're down here. So I want to start with Mary. You know, space has become a logistics and a defense domain. How do you think about readiness when disruption in orbit could cascade down here on Earth?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is you ask that question as if it's something in the future, but it actually is now and it's in the past. And before we were as reliant on the space-based capabilities that we take for granted today, in March 1989, there was a corona mass ejection, so a big part of the sun, the size of Jupiter, was released, and that radiation and energy actually destroyed several satellites, right? They couldn't handle that amount of electromagnetic activity. So several satellites were damaged. That kept moving toward the Earth, and it took down the power grid in Quebec, Canada, which was not hardened against that kind of. It took down the power grid for 9 hours. At that point, people didn't, the people in Quebec, Canada knew that they didn't have power and heat in March. But so think about today. We have so many more capabilities that are space-based. So if precision timing is disrupted, you can't get ATM. We can't do stock trading. There's so many things reliant on the timing. Navigation that we take for granted. The social media version of navigation, Waze, or things like that. In that, communications, right? So you can keep going. The in-transit visibility for the supply chain, logistics, right? Where is everything? Where are all the people? GPS. And so as you continue to look at all of the things that are affected, it will create cascading effects. And so with that integration of those capabilities, it's a disruption that happens in space is not going to stay in space. We're definitely going to feel the impacts in terrestrial land, and they are probably going to end up being cascading and cumulative.
So yeah, not something we think about every day, but this dovetails nicely, I think, Debbie, into your research. The idea of tackling resilience in extreme conditions and then leveraging microgravity in low Earth orbit. How does that science underpin stability in the infrastructure that we rely on every day?
Thank you for the question. So my group researches microelectronics and radiation-hardened and high-temperature environments to probe the extremes of space and also the extremes of terrestrial environments such as nuclear energy. A big part of that is understanding how the materials work under radiation attack and also how the defects in the material can change the electrical transport. So I came here via Waymo at the recommendation of Lee White, who was on the earlier panel, and I trusted those electronics, right? I trusted that one of the defects didn't trigger activation of a deep level trap that would change the electronic stability of the circuitry that got me here today. In addition, alpha particles can enter Earth's atmosphere and disrupt electronics. So I've spent my career trying to overcome these anomalies and harness the power of microgravity to create bigger and better materials that might help us prevent catastrophic events in mobile systems. Also, we rely on this type of technology to have reliable rockets, reusable rockets, in fact. Your cell phones require advanced materials that work reliably. And so I'm excited about the opportunity to use space to advance, again, the materials that are a part of our everyday lives.
Thanks. And Peggy, speaking of rockets in space, you experienced firsthand how dependent we are on orbital communications and systems. What did living and working in space teach you about preparing for, some of the disruption we're talking about right here?
Yeah, there's lots of disruptions in space, but one of my sayings is the only constant in spaceflight is change. And I think teams have to be ready for that change. And if you are, you're much more resilient and better able and equipped to deal with change. If you anticipate that your best well-laid plan that you spent years on is not going to end up to be exactly the way you planned it out to be, I think it builds an expectation of every team member to contribute, come up with the ideas and the solutions, because you know that there will be disruption, there will be change, and it's not only spaceflight that changes, it's pretty much everyday life.
Everyday life. But you mentioned teams, so you've spent all this time in space. What did that teach you about trust, not only in people, but trust in your systems, trust in yourself? Maybe talk a little bit about the training, your education, all those things you have to trust when you're up there.
Yeah, there is a lot of trust involved. You know, when you're stepping on a rocket that's got hundreds of thousands of gallons of very explosive materials, and it's got hundreds of systems and engineering parts that have to work together in tightly choreographed sequence for everything to go perfectly, there has to be a lot of trust. You have to trust the designers who came up with that idea in the first place of how you were going to accomplish life support systems or how you were going to accomplish guidance and navigation. All of those designs have to then be tested, built, and you have to trust every step of the way that everyone is doing their job. But I really feel like trust is like a full circle thing. Even as an operator, we have to be trusted operators as well. We have to be able to follow the procedures and perform as we've been trained. And so I think the teamwork comes out when everyone trusts in each other. And then on those days when you have the bad day realities of losing friends, then everyone is trusted to dig in and find the root cause and make sure it doesn't happen again.
That's a great point. Jeannie, thinking about combat aviation, how do you build that same trust across teams, groups, squadrons under pressure?
I think that there's a number of factors. So one of the things, the Air Force has these core values, right? And one of those core values is integrity first. And I think that's so critical for everyone to have as a common understanding. Because whenever I would walk out to the jet and the maintainer handed me the forms, I was literally putting my life in his hands. And so I trusted that all the maintenance, inspections, everything had taken place. But to combat aviation broadly, you know, it's critically important to have trust because your life depends on it. You know, there are adversaries that are trying to shoot you out of the sky. And so I think the training plays a key role here. History has taught us that we need to train the way we're going to fight. And so the training is constantly evolving because it needs to stay relevant and realistic. And we really try to make it high stakes during training to simulate the stress that you're going to encounter when you're in combat. And a core component of aviation is the idea of flight discipline. Okay, that's critical to combat aviation. And the idea is that every team member knows their roles and responsibilities, and they will be held accountable for their actions. So for a given mission, the commander will communicate the plan, the objectives, and the briefing, and then go through every possible imaginable contingency. And that common operating picture allows all the team members to remain flexible and adaptable when they encounter those unanticipated situations. And so they can do real-time risk assessment and make decisions in accordance with the mission objectives. And then after every flight, there's the debrief. And in the debrief, the flight lead will go through what were the mission objectives. And for anything that didn't go in accordance with the plan, they conduct what we call root cause analysis and then provide instructional fixes for any of those items so that next time we're more effective on the next mission. And as you know, Bill, the debriefs are brutally honest. And it's critically important to have that because that accountability and that honesty we have is what ensures we stay the best Air Force in the world. And I think that helps build the trust that you need across teams.
So just to pull on that for a minute, because it's something I've heard of a lot out in industry, even with this idea of a debrief culture. Can you maybe explain a little bit more about, you know, what we do in the Air Force that maybe could translate out to corporate America? I mean, when we kind of shed the rank, we shed the position, and we just have real frank conversations.
The rank stays at the door. It is a known thing. It doesn't matter if you're a second lieutenant or four-star general. When you walk into that debrief room, there is no rank. It is just your position in the formation and how did you do in your roles and responsibilities. And it's respectful, but it's brutally honest because that's how we get better. And so we go through everything. You know, how was the planning? How was the briefing? How was the execution? Anytime something didn't go as planned or could have been better, we debrief it because we want to always get better. And, you know, as a weapons school instructor, you know, debrief was near and dear to my heart because that's how we get better as a team. We must always be learning and always improving.
So if you don't know, weapons school in the Air Force, that's our Top Gun school. So that's what that means.
We didn't have a movie.
Yeah, we missed that opportunity someday. Debbie, as an innovator, and in my role at Dare University, spent a lot of time in that innovation space. So from the innovation and a technological perspective, how do you think innovations reinforce or even challenge maybe human trust?
Yeah, so when you're innovating in space, especially from a research or science perspective, you get one shot to get it right because we have limited access to space. I don't get to do hundreds of experiments. I have one shot. So as Jeannie noted, briefing is really, really important throughout the execution of the mission. So I work with my students at Stanford to brief on the experimental plan with our industrial partners so that we can have a successful mission. We also think about stability. So maybe there'll be delays in launch and our experiment might be sitting there for months. How do we trust and develop processes that will allow the mission to be successful? And then once we send up the payload on a SpaceX rocket, right, the command center, we trust the engineers and technicians to enable that successful launch. And then we rely on astronauts like Peggy to actually execute the mission once we're on board station. So we've conducted 3 missions on the International Space Station. And once that precious payload, right, one shot, once that precious payload comes back, we actually have it hand-delivered. It goes onto a flight and hand-delivered to us back at the lab so we can analyze it. And debriefing all along the way, it's very, very important. So access to space is something that I think should be a part of the conversation today, and having protocols so that we can harness all of these wonderful opportunities.
So when you think about astral materials and you think about your job at Stanford, is there a way that maybe between those two, or how Stanford, a little biased about Stanford, but how Stanford enables that innovation? Is there something key to what is Stanford?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that at Stanford, it's a very entrepreneurial environment. I've gotten a lot of support in taking my research out of the lab into the commercial sector. We actually have programs. I'm working with MBA students to teach me about the entrepreneurial process and things like value proposition of the technology. So I think Stanford is unique in that way. Yeah.
So I just want to put a pin in this innovation thing for a minute. And Mary, what are your thoughts about innovation, maybe where you're at now, or your time in the Air Force doing things like joint domain operations? I mean, there's a lot of innovation. When you were doing this, it was all brand new. In fact, you might be the queen of all domain or joint domain operations.
Yeah, I think something to keep in mind when we're talking about innovation in the Department of Defense. When I started my career last century, the military had the most technologically advanced capabilities. And so the leadership today grew up or started their career with the mindset that look at all these new technological things we have. And I don't know if it was maybe Y2K, 2000 or so. I don't remember exactly when, but that has flipped. And so now, when you're looking at the most innovative capabilities, you're usually not looking into mainstream Department of Defense. There are pockets like DARPA, but for mainstream innovation, we're looking to commercial industry, which is producing things faster with perhaps not as much legislative restriction on what you can do. So what that meant to me is, how do we create those connections When I was working with the very first Predator drone or UAV, people wanted that data. They wanted that full motion video. We didn't have the technology in DoD to use, we didn't have enough bandwidth in the military satellite communications, right? And well, it turns out that there's commercial satellite comms. And so I kept pulling the thread of this is what we want to do. And if we can't do it organically, then is there somewhere out there that somebody is doing something like that and they don't realize that it has national security implications? And so I find myself in an integrator role, sort of speaking both languages, the STEM language, the technology language, but also the operator that is planning for and employing, kinetic effects or defending our pilots from kinetic effects. So I think innovation, when I think about it now, it has to continue even closer down that path of collaboration.
Yeah, I think innovation and collaboration are definitely, they have to be linked together. And then, Peggy, I've got a two-parter for you. One, just to come in on this innovation concept, because if you think about this, I mean, I'm just thinking about the DoD in terms of a large bureaucracy and trying to innovate inside a large bureaucracy, which is really difficult. But NASA is also a large bureaucracy. Do you have any thoughts on innovating inside of large bureaucracies?
Well, I think it's been interesting going from NASA. I worked there for 28 years, and in 2018 left, expecting never to, necessarily be involved in space again. And less than 5 years later, I was on another flight, and it was with a commercial company and a commercial enterprise, Axiom Space. And to me, it was just amazing how quickly the space industry is changing right now. And I think it's really exciting. I think people are a lot more excited about. There's a lot more commercial venues that are exploring different options and avenues of getting into space. And I was talking to some of the guys last night about how they need to be, thinking about getting in and out of space, in that logistics framework, because I think space is going to be a commercial economy, just like Debbie talked about. We are going to be doing things in zero gravity, and that innovation and the ability to do it commercially, which the governments haven't been able to do because they're not allowed to make money, so we have to do it commercially, I think is a really exciting avenue for our future. I think microgravity is going to be used as a tool to do all kinds of things. I'm, very excited by the idea that, we can make better superconductor crystals, better fiber optics. We could make perfect lenses that you could replace in your eye. We can do 3D tissue printing in space. And I think, all of that potential has really a huge potential impact here on Earth. And we're just using gravity, the lack of gravity, as a tool. And so...
Okay, so it's going to be a triple question then. Because now we just unlocked something here that I just have to pursue. So we're thinking about commercial space. We had this conversation earlier today. Which company do you think right now has the most potential in space, and who is the fast follower?
Which company?
Yeah,
There's not one company. I think to be competitive, to have commercial space, there has to be competition. There has to be multiple ones. And I think, right now, I think there's, so many opportunities in so many different areas that you're going to have people filling in the niches that are required and necessary. Axiom Space is hoping to build the first space station. SpaceX has got crew and cargo into low Earth orbit nailed. And so we need competition for them. We need competition for Axiom Space. May the best survive.
So with launch, who do you think is the fast follower to SpaceX?
With launch, fastest follower?
Yeah.
Probably Blue or Boeing. Boeing's had some problems, so I'm hoping Blue comes through for us.
So I'm going to go back to trust. I know we went down this road of innovation, and that's just my own little peeve. So Peggy, my follow-up would that be, share a moment when trust in your crew and your systems made a big difference between mission success and failure.
Well, there's lots of instances of that. I think one of the most interesting stories I have is when I was the commander on Expedition 16 and a shuttle arrived. Pam Melroy was the commander on that shuttle. First time 2 female commanders of 2 different spacecraft in space at the same time, but who's counting? But anyway, we ended up getting up there, and our crews were working together to reassemble parts of the space station. We were deploying a piece of the truss all the way out to the very end of a 100-yard-long truss segment, and we were deploying a solar array. And the solar array had been packed up, and we had to send out the arrays. And 115-foot side of the array went out, no problem. The other one went out about 3/4 of the way and started tearing. And so we aborted it, and then we're like, what are we going to do now? Because the shuttle couldn't undock while we had this floppy solar array that wasn't analyzed. And so, but we had to trust in the ground team to come up with a solution. And it really, I was afraid the solution would be we'd have to jettison the array, and which would have impacted the further development of the station by cutting out 1/4 of the power. So it mattered. But we had to trust the team on the ground. Engineers on the ground, a young kid came up with this idea of how about let's make cufflinks and, span the tear. And so that, because there were integral holes in the solar array, so we could span the tear and stitch it basically so that it wouldn't tear more as we tried to continue the deploy. But in order to get somebody out there to do that, required the sportiest robotics ever, because we didn't have an arm that could reach that far. So we had to use the shuttle inspection arm attached to the station big arm, move it all the way out to the end of the truss, and put the tallest crew member we had out there on EVA.
Wow. Wow.
But all of the pieces came together because the ground team, had come up with this very elegant solution. They had teams working, on the EVA part, the robotics part, and, the building the cufflinks that we stitched in. All of it had to be done de novo up there because there's not a Home Depot you can go to.
Exactly. Wow. So I'm just pondering that story, and I don't know how many of you have the same idea in your mind, but how long would something like that take? Is that are we talking an hour, 6 hours, 2 days?
It took about three days to plan.
Okay.
Yeah, so we had to do everything else that was part of the mission plan for while they were docked so that then we could be ready to do this contingency EVA. Time
and space, wow. So data manufacturing, tech transfer. Debbie, I'm going to throw this one back to you. Much of what starts in national security migrates into everyday life. With emerging technologies, what emerging technologies do you see becoming foundational for global commerce?
Absolutely. So my group researches dual-use technology in the area of microelectronics, rad-hard electronics for defense, but also extreme environment electronics for in situ probing of terrestrial environments such as nuclear energy, reactors. And I've been using the International Space Station as a platform to advance microelectronics for these types of markets. And unfortunately, the ISS is going to be decommissioned in 2030. So Peggy is now in the commercial sector, right? We have Axiom Space that is lined up to potentially be the next commercial station. We have 5 years to develop this supply chain, right? We have reusable rockets, thanks to SpaceX, Northrop Grumman, other companies. But on deck are companies that are creating free flyers, space planes, I love this idea of competition, right? So we have other commercial stations that are underway. We also have companies that are thinking about up mass and down mass. How do we safely bring products back to Earth? So I think this is an exciting time and opportunity. And again, we have 5 years to do this. So it's wonderful to hear about, the opportunities in how we can work together to create the infrastructure and the supply chain that is economically viable. I'm looking at it from the materials point of view. I'm not interested in developing all of the infrastructure and hardware. I want to use the infrastructure to actually perform the manufacturing. My company is focused on the materials alone and how we can make them better in microgravity environments. So I think we're going to start to see very specific industrial domains, but they just will happen to be in low Earth orbit.
Yeah, and the whole supply chain thing is mind-boggling then.
Yeah.
We start thinking about space. Peggy, back to you. From an orbital communication to autonomous systems, which one space-driven innovation do you believe will most transform life on Earth, let's say in the next decade?
Well, I went through a short list before, but I think pharmaceuticals, probably because I'm a biochemist by background, and so pharmaceuticals and therapies, drug therapies, for instance, stem cell therapies. Stem cells grow better in space, and potentially the 3D modeling of tissues that could be used for transplant.
So in the biotech, I'm just pondering the space station and the 5 years. Do you care to comment on what can be done in 5 years? Again, we'll go back to time and space, right? So the idea of 5 years, that sounds very short to me. Dealing with DoD timelines, it's like 5 years, we can't do anything. In a space timeline, how does that space station come to be in 5 years?
So we're hoping to have our first module. Axiom Space is the only company that has a contract with NASA to attach our module to the International Space Station. So we'll be able to use the space station for a period of time. NASA wanted us to change our assembly sequence because we were planning to build our whole vehicle attached to the space station. And they need us off by 2028 so they can start practicing using the deorbit system and understand that propulsion system. So we will launch in 2027, be off by 2028, dock to our second module, which will then allow us to have four-person human presence, permanent human presence in space. So I assume everybody knows, but in the last 25 years, we've had a U.S. human presence in space, continuous, in the last 25 years. And that will hopefully last for another 5 more years. But if we ever have a gap, it always ends up being longer than we want it to be. And so I think it's really important that Axiom has a plan to have an overlap so that we can maintain that U.S. presence in space.
No, I did not know that. I'm sure you all knew that, right? So just to ask one more question, since I have the mic. Deorbit. How do you deorbit a space station?
Very carefully.
Is it land? The wheels come out?
No. It's going to come in and be burning up and falling apart as it's coming up. And so that's why they need to do the analysis about the propulsion system and how they'll be able to direct it to re-enter somewhere in the middle of a big ocean.
Very good. So Mary, from a readiness perspective, what's one area of defense innovation that this audience should watch most closely?
Well, I think we've spent a lot of the day talking about it already, and it would be autonomy. And Debbie mentioned dual use in microelectronics. There's a lot of dual use in autonomy. One of my concerns, since I've been, on the other side, not wearing camouflage anymore, is in the DoD side, there's a lot of planning for using autonomous, whether they're maritime, subsurface, ground, or air, right, for a military purpose or a logistical purpose that would support military operations, things like that. What I don't see that now, thanks to the genius of Tracy Ward and her seating arrangement last night, is sitting next to people that are like Dave Merrill, who is building a purpose-built cargo autonomous vehicle, designed from the beginning to support commercial applications. And then, of course, a lot of the return on investment is if you can get a big DoD contract with the Army or the Marines or things like that. And so while the commercial autonomy ecosystem is talking about integration with the military and working together, I don't see those same conversations happening on the DoD side. And so when they're talking about swarms of drones or combat collaborative aircraft or, something along those lines, taking into account that there may be swarms of friendly, not military-owned and operated autonomous vehicles. And so while I absolutely see those uses, when my husband was in Afghanistan in Helmand delivering, he was responsible for logistics for all of Helmand province and using humans to deliver ammunition, food, water, fuel for all the vehicles and stuff. And there was danger associated with that. I suspect that is something that we might want to do autonomously. And would it be one of the vehicles that's being delivered or developed for long haul today? So I think that having industry thinking about that and perhaps demanding some conversations from the beginning of what integration looks like to be operating in that space together, as opposed to developing capabilities and procedures and then saying, oh, we want to work together.
That's good. I know we're getting a little low on time, so I wanted to do kind of a lightning round and go to each one of you and ask a question. And so, Jeannie, we'll start with you. If you could ask the leaders in this room who really run the world's supply chain to do one thing differently tomorrow, what would that be?
Well, I don't know if it's do it differently, but do it more. Like make sure that the supply system is robust and resilient, redundant if necessary. Because any kind of perturbation or anomaly or attack, we've got to be resilient to that. We learned in COVID how trust is important in the supply system because there's this interesting human phenomenon that's, panic buying or whatever you want to call it, where things got a little bit crazy. And so the importance of the resilience of that supply system. And I know we all call it supply chain, but I don't like the analogy because it's only as strong as its weakest link. So I always think about the supply system more as like mesh, where you can take hits here and there, but the system can self-correct and they can find other pathways to ensure that we have resilience in our supply system.
I like that, system versus chain. That's good. Debbie, what do you think?
So I want the folks in this audience to think about the cost of access to space going down in 2050. It's approximated to be $10 per kilogram.
Wow.
And so what will that supply chain, sorry I'm using supply chain, what will that supply chain look like? What infrastructure do we need? And also I want to remind you that low Earth orbit is only hundreds of miles away. It's not that far away, and so we can think about the potential for actual factories just hundreds of miles away, but it happens to be in low Earth orbit.
Great. Mary?
I would build off of what Jeannie said, and I would ask all of you to tell your story to the rest of us. Most of the time, we don't really hear much about what's happening in the supply chain until something is broken, and I can't get X, Y, or Z. And so I think if you could tell your story more and include more details, like the interdependence, right? I think some people don't understand this invisible global integration that is out there and how reliant we all are. And so I would ask you to tell that story more and say, hey, we understand that policy, but we need X from Germany, Y from India, and precursor Z from China. And if you want us to do that domestically, we don't have a path to get there in the next 5 years. One of my thoughts is if more people understood how every country is critically dependent on other countries, that perhaps we would have second thoughts and the cost of conflict would be considered prohibitive. So I view you as sort of another version of deterrence.
That's good.
I like that.
Peggy?
I think the one thing that perspective is what you gain the most from being in space and seeing our planet from above. And I think it's a very important point. But what I think is, in general, we think about Earth where we're sitting here and the people we've interacted, the places we've visited, or the things we've seen. And it's very small compared to what the perspective is when you see it from space. And I like to think of Earth as our spaceship Earth, because you see this really fine, delicate atmosphere that we all share. We all share the same resources that are on this planet. We all share the same radiation protection from the geomagnetosphere. You know, this is our spaceship out in space. And it's very interconnected. All of us are interconnected on that spaceship. And I think when it comes to supply chains, when it comes to life, we need to think about those connections. So I would encourage everyone to embrace the connections that we have here on planet Earth. And in low Earth orbit, too.
That's excellent. Thank you. I'm a little upset. I really wanted to work space pirates into this conversation. I wasn't able to do that. But thank you, ladies, so much. I know I learned a lot. I assume you all learned a lot. So thank you so much.
Yeah.